Montgomery was full of racial segregation and discrimination. On Thursday, December 1st, 1995, Rosa Parks sat right behind the whites-only section on the bus, and as the bus started to fill up, she was asked to move for a white man. After she refused, she was arrested. The death of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old African-American who was brutally beaten to death, inspired Rosa. Montgomery previously had 7 years of grassroots activism. E.D. Nixon, president of the Alabama State Branch, helped organize the boycott. The boycott was arranged to take place on Monday, December 5th, the day of Rosa Parks' trial. The Montgomery Improvement Association was formed to coordinate the boycott. Martin Luther King Jr., a new pastor in the area, became president of the MIA. King tied the movement to Christianity, which helped King gain support. The three objectives of the boycott were to seek courteous treatment of black riders, a first-come, first-served basis, and employment of some black drivers. The boycott lasted 381 days, with King's house being bombed and Parks receiving multiple death threats, and the bus company suffering major financial losses. The boycott was successful because it stayed local and lasted for such an extended period of time. The boycott showed blacks could exploit economic power and use it to their aid. It also helped King appeal to the masses more easily and help him push the civil rights movement.
What was the impact of sit-ins and freedom rides? On February 1st, 1960, four nicely dressed black students walked into a Woolworth store in Greensboro, North Carolina, and sat down at a whites-only counter and were refused service. They sat there until closing, reading the Bible. The next day, 29 showed up, and the third day, there were 63. Students were met by violence and were arrested. Mobs of whites abused the students and started to spread to other cities. By August, there were 70,000 students participated and 30,600 has been arrested. There was a growing impatience. In the 1960s, desegregation of public institutions were extremely slow or not happening at all. Educated youth were growing impatient. The North and South activists became united through the media. In Nashville, Tennessee, James Lawson organized the Christian students to hold sit-ins throughout the city and also pushed boycotts. The students were arrested and quickly replaced. Jails became overcrowded and so many were released even though bail was reduced to $5. Some stores started to desegregate lunch counters, but it would take another 4 years for other public spaces. The response of the NAACP and the SCLC. At first, the NAACP was critical of sit-ins and preferred legal routes. The SCLC feared students were being too confrontational. Throughout the course, both provided legal aid and training and finance. The media played a significant role in publicizing the campaign and showed difference in behavior. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, was formed in April 1960 by Ella Baker. Baker called on student leaders, 126 students from 56 colleges in 12 states, challenged students to take direct action against discrimination in voting, housing, and jobs. She wanted an independent organization with group-centered leadership. SNCC was independent of the SCLC, and the majority was under 21, highly democratic and less male-dominant compared to the SCLC, and still focused on nonviolent action. Freedom Rides, 1961. In May 1961, 13 volunteers, 6 white, 7 black, rode to D.C. to New Orleans and sat together and ignored segregated restrooms and restaurants. James Farmer, leader and founder of CORE, focused on challenging segregation in interstate transport, which has been declared unconstitutional in 1946 and was still being ignored in 1960. The goal was to create a crisis at a bus terminal in the South by provoking extremists, which would attract publicity. This would force federal government to enforce the law. Freedom Riders bus arrived in Anston, Alabama, where they were firebombed and beaten by a mob. Those who were not hospitalized traveled to Birmingham, and the police gave the KKK 15 minutes before intervention. The response of the federal government. Dependent on the Southern Democrats in Congress, he did not want to intervene to divide the party and alienate Southern Democrats. JFK was reluctant to use federal troops, and Robert threatened to use U.S. Marshals if local authorities did not set up. SNCC joined in on the Freedom Rides and were met with violence, even the reporters. King met to address Montgomery violence, and that resulted in violence at the church. King called Robert and 400 U.S. Marshals stepped in. Tear gas was used. first use of federal force since Little Rock in 1957. Robert Kennedy asked for a cooling off period, but Farmer replied, "We've been cooling off for 100 years. If we got any cooler, we'd be in deep freeze." Over 1,000 more activists rode on the Freedom buses, and in November 1961, Robert Kennedy pushed the Interstate Commerce Commission to enforce desegregation, 15 years after court ruling.
The March on Washington was organized by the leaders of all of the leading civil rights groups as an attempt to put pressure on Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act. In the event, as many as 250,000 people showed up for the march, and it is recorded as the largest mass protest in the USA. All of the main civil rights leaders spoke, and it included MLK's famous "I Have a Dream" speech. It is considered a major success as it was peaceful and celebratory. It was broadcasted on live TV for 3 hours, and it was even shown in countries outside the US. It was seen as a unifying cause in which the races came together to support a single cause. It did not bring a swift passing of the Civil Rights Act, but it was unifying and had a large audience that even reached an international scale that brought on an influx of public support. Project Confrontation was a plan for Birmingham, Alabama, created by MLK and the SCLC. It aimed to desegregate businesses and force them to employ blacks through peaceful marches around the city. The demonstrators were met by police brutality and violence that attracted mass media attention. They were attacked with police dogs and batons, even though they were unarmed. This had a great impact, and 50 cities in the South agreed to desegregation to avoid events similar to what happened in Birmingham. It is considered a great success, and as many as 100,000 people demonstrated across the USA in 1963 against segregation, job discrimination, and police brutality. It can easily be argued as the turning point of the civil rights movement for the black population. Malcolm X was a popular and influential figure in the civil rights movement. He was known as a more radical leader who had controversial ideas when it came to civil rights and equality for African Americans.